Good morning. Welcome to our class again together. Today we are in John chapter 19. We're talking about the death of Christ. As John begins to wrap toward the end of his gospel, it'll be this week and the next week, and we'll complete the Gospel of John. But for this week, I wanted to let you think about something. This seems to be more sober than maybe we ought to make it. One is, what happens when you're about to die? Now, we all know about making preparations for things. We know about last will and testaments and things like that. But there are two different emotions that come up when death approaches. One is this overwhelming sense of grief and loss and parting. What has been will be no more. We know that for sure. But the other is what we hear at the funeral, which is there is a sense of hope of what is coming as opposed to what has come before. For John, when he comes to the gospel, he comes to the death of Jesus, and he puts a little bit different idea to that. Yes, there seems to be the sense of loss among many people. Yes, there seems to be this foreshadowing that something greater is going to happen. But for John, he examines his gospel differently than some of the other gospel writers. They all agree to the essentials. I mean, if you were to ask the question, do they all agree? And the answer is yes. They've still got Jesus being paraded out to Calvary, carrying the cross on his shoulders. They all have him laid across the cross stands of the cross, where his hands are nailed into it and his feet are nailed into the saddle of the vertical. He's dropped into the ground, where he begins to heave and hoe and struggle for breath as he pushes himself up in a slow dance of strangulation. We know that he's going to die, we know he's going to be buried, and we know he's going to be raised from the dead. Those are the facts that nothing changes. I always find it interesting, though, that scholars think that if they're not identical, somebody must have made something up. The truth is, gospels are selective. John has been very selective, as we've seen in his gospel. He has chosen certain things to talk about that emphasize a single idea, and that is, do you believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God? That's his driving idea. And so we come to this lesson, and one of the things we find when we come to the cross of Christ is the flow of time reaches its apex. Not its end, but its apex. And we're going to see something very valid, something very powerful as we go through all of this. And so there are these things that we meet in this story as John tells it from his perspective, the things he wants us and his audience that he writes to know, to understand, and to grasp. So let's dive in. The first has to do with an encounter with Pilate. Now, Pilate is in all the stories of the Gospels. Jesus appears before Pilate for one simple reason. He is the only one, according to Roman law, who can pronounce the death sentence. And so all four Gospels agree to the fact that the Jews had to send him to Pilate, and Pilate didn't know what to do with him. But John fills in a blank that we really need to hear. When you come to John chapter 18, verses 33 to 40, it says, "So Pilate entered his headquarters again and called Jesus and said to him, 'Are you the king of the Jews?' And Jesus answered, 'Do you say this of your own accord, or do others say it about me?' Pilate answered, 'Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done?' Jesus answered, 'My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would be fighting, that I might not be delivered to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from the world.' Then Pilate said to him, 'So you are a king?' Jesus answered, 'You say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into this world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice.' And Pilate said to him, 'What is truth?' After he had said this, he went back outside to the Jews and told them, I find no guilt in him. But you have a custom that I should release one man for you at the Passover. So do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews? And they answered out again, not this man, but Barabbas. But now Barabbas was a robber. In this story, we find some interesting things about the character of, um, of Pilate. Pilate, first of all, appears to be fairly ignorant of the things he's being asked to judge about. The only thing he knows is the Jews have a beef, and so they delivered him over here to me, and they want me to figure this out so I can rid them of the problem of executing an innocent man. He knows nothing about what Jesus has done. He seems to know nothing about what Jesus has said. He knows nothing about the miracles, apparently. He seems to be completely ignorant. Probably he's blissfully ignorant. He doesn't want to know all of these things because those are Jewish things and he doesn't care. But the second thing we know is he evades his responsibility. He has a responsibility. Rome has given him a job. The job is simple: to maintain order in the place he's sent and to execute Roman justice in the way it should be. Roman justice called for an innocent man to be freed and a guilty man to be executed. But as we see in this, he doesn't want to do that task because it will create a political firestorm. So he is trying to get out of making this judgment, having Jesus trapped in his own words, or trying to get something else to happen, but he doesn't want to be the judge. But he also wants to compromise. If you cannot be honest and act with integrity, maybe we can compromise this all to where we all feel good about this. So he wants to release Barabbas, but they demand that he release Barabbas. He'd love to release Jesus, really. But Barabbas, the man who has killed fathers, raped mothers, and taken children hostage, is the preferred criminal in the crowd. And Jesus is turned over to be crucified. And the last thing is, he doesn't seem to know what the truth is anymore. Now, sometimes we read the statement in John, where it's only in John, where he says, and what is truth? As if he is scornful. What is truth? He might have said it that way, but I'd like for you to put yourself in the role of Pilate this morning. How did he feel? What was his background? Why might he have said that? I want you to think about Pilate. He grew up in Rome. He is indoctrinated with the philosophers of Greece and Rome. He is raised to believe in the Roman pantheon of gods, as silly as they seem sometimes. He is told by all of these sources, this is the truth. So he goes to Palestine and he's wearied by the Jewish leaders trying to tell him the truth of the Talmud. And now Jesus comes and said, if you listen to my voice, I am truth. And Pilate says, what is truth anyway? He's confused, like so many other people in society today. If you were to think about what our society is like, it is inundated with information. There's all kinds of things coming at us that says, this is true, this is true, this is true. And I'm at a loss sometimes to say, what's really the truth anymore? If you can convince a small group of people that your lie is the truth and they're willing to believe it, that now has become the new truth. There is no absolute truth, it seems, only the convenient truth that I hope that you'll believe. It happens in politics, it happens in law, it happens in government, it happens in the church. So what is truth? I think Pilate must be very confused. He doesn't know what to do with this man. He doesn't know what to believe about him. And he'd like to just go home and do nothing. But I think John includes this little encounter in his discussion for a very particular reason. I think it's for an audience that will come away years later and read this. John will still be alive. He'll be an old man. It's the end of the first century. There is a madman named Domitian on the throne. He is now the Caesar. He is demanding that everyone uh, burn incense and proclaim Caesar is Lord. And when they come to the Christians, they absolutely refuse because Jesus is Lord, not Caesar. It would cost John his freedom as he was exiled to Patmos. So, how do you explain what your belief is to an unbelieving society? It's through these words. Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. I am not a threat to the powers that be. I am not an insurrectionist trying to take over control. I do not want to lead a rebellion and cast the Romans out of Palestine. My kingdom is not of this world." You can almost hear the Christians as they make their defense says, we follow a king who is not a king in this world. We obey the king of this world as far as we can, but we have a king in a different world. It makes the perfect answer in difficult circumstances. But I'd like for you to think about this as well. The truth is that the judge is being judged. In reality, when we make judgments about Christ, we're the ones being judged. Pilate was being sized up by God and by history to find out who he was, what he would believe, and what he would do. Truth is, you and I, when we encounter Jesus, we're being judged, even though we're making the judgment. So, what judgment do you make? But you know the story. Pilate basically washes his hands of the situation. He gives him over to the Jews and said, what you're going to do, go ahead and do. Jesus is led out to Calvary. There he's nailed to a cross. But John wants to tell us about things that are happening around the cross, not just on the cross. Because what he says about the death of Jesus is austere. It doesn't have a lot of detail to it. It is the bare bones facts. But what you read is the rich texture of the people surrounding the cross and how that interplay comes into mind. First of all, we meet the soldiers who put him there. One of the things they do when they crucify you is they strip you of your garments. You're laid naked. Now you're not just dying, but you're also exposed to shame. It's part of the rigmarole. But we read in John, beginning in verse 23 of chapter 19, now when the soldiers who crucified Jesus, they took his garments and divided them into 4 parts, 1 part for each soldier, also his tunic. But the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. So they said to one another, let us not tear it, but cast lots to see whose it shall be. And this was to fulfill the scripture which says, they divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. So the soldiers did these things. The soldiers saw that the tunic that Jesus wore, that outer garment, was specially tailored for him. Probably his mother had made it. It was one piece of cloth with an opening for the arms and for the head, all sewn with one seam. And the only way they could divide it would be to destroy it. And so they decided, we'll just cast lots for it. They gambled for it. Winner take all. Now, what do you make about those soldiers? One of the things you find out is they have a terrible form of indifference. They don't care what's going on around them. They don't care that Jesus is dying. They are so focused on getting what they want, when they want it, at the moment they want it. They don't care. We've met people like that. That when you talk about who Jesus is and the power of his salvation, they basically yawn at you and say, I don't care. Those are these guards, these soldiers who are so hardened to the realities of crucifixion. They just ignore what's going on. And so it is the indifferent in our world are the same. The problem with indifference is not that it is so terrible, but what it really means. Elie Wiesel was a Jewish Nazi hunter, was the best way to put it. He had survived the concentration camps in the Second World War, and he made it his life's mission to hunt down those responsible and bring them to justice. Many were convicted, many were executed. One of the things he found out was he went through life trying to persuade people about the passion that he had for bringing people to justice for the most heinous crimes of all of human history. And he said, I found that many of them just didn't want to listen. They didn't care. That was history. It means nothing to me. So he made this observation. The opposite of love is not hatred, but indifference. You see, the problem is that indifference may be worse than rejection, for indifference has not measured anything and just rejects on the basis of I don't want to mess with it. I don't care. You meet that at the cross. And then also there is a group of women. This is a story told only by John as well. It says, but standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, Woman, behold your son. Then he said to the disciple, Behold your mother. And from that hour the disciple took her into his own home. We know nothing about Mary, the wife of Clopas. We know some about Mary Magdalene. What's interesting is Mary, the mother of Jesus, only appears twice in the Gospel of John. One in John chapter 2, when she is asking Jesus about what are you going to do about the wine that has run out? And the other is here. Jesus turns to the disciple whom he loves, meaning John himself. That was John's way of calling himself that, kind of a way of humility. He feels the love of Christ, by the way, the disciple whom Jesus loved. And he turns to him and he hands off care of his mother. What's interesting in this little piece, there are a lot of things that come to bear, I suppose, but one is that Jesus is closing out his earthly life. His final responsibility as a man is to deal with his family. And now, as his life passes away, his earthly ministry is ending at this moment. And so he has tied up all the loose ends he needs to tie up. He's done all the miracles he needs to do. He's taught all the lessons he's going to teach. And now comes the moment. There's a moment that comes that John describes briefly. In fact, I like the way John describes it. It's intrigued me for many years. It says in John 19 and verse 30, when Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, It is finished. And bowing his head, he gave up his spirit. It is finished. I pondered that phrase for many reasons. One is because I've never had the experience in my whole life of being finished with anything. There's never a moment where there's no more work to be done. In fact, if I ever feel like I'm finished, 4 more things will take its place. And so Jesus says, I'm finished. Well, what do you think he means by I am finished? Well, scholars have said all things. Some believe that it means that he just died. My life is over. But that sounds kind of fatalistic for Jesus. And I don't think it has what John's trying to say anyway. Some have said, well, I have finished my ministry on earth. I have completed the work that was sent for me to do. And there's a sense of that, but that still leaves a lot of room at the top of the cup to be filled. I've always thought that what this really means, if you look at the panorama of all the Bible, it means very simply this: Jesus came to this moment, and the plan of God reached its apex. It was finished. You go back to the book of Genesis, Genesis chapter 3, and sin enters the world. God has a plan to deal with the sin of the world. He talks about the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent in these very guarded, very hazy terms. You go through places like Deuteronomy, and you talk about a prophet, and you talk about a servant in Isaiah, and you talk about these other things, and suddenly you come, and through the flow of time, things have changed. You've had servitude, you've had slavery, you've had captivity in Babylon, you've had the destruction of a temple, you've had a return of the wanderer. God has been there in all these things. But where does it all end? Here, right there, at the cross. It is finished. God has accomplished the grand purpose of his plan when Jesus dies on the cross as a sacrifice for the sins of all mankind. The it is the plan of God. The finished sounds like it's just over, but it's a word that can mean completed, aged, ripe. It can describe a cup that has been filled up to the last drop. It is now complete. The plan of God with all of those things scattered through the Old Testament, now it is complete. What a powerful message that is. And then there's one other thing that John wants to add at the cross. So the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and of the other one who had been crucified with him. But when they came to Jesus and saw he was already dead, they didn't break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water. He who saw it has borne witness. His testimony is true, and he knows that he is telling the truth, that you also may believe. For these things took place that the scripture might be fulfilled. Not one of his bones will be broken. And again, another scripture that says, they will look on him whom they have pierced. You have this last moment. The protocol called for the soldiers to go by because the Jews did not want a body hanging on a cross after sundown to hasten the death. The way it was done, a mallet was taken and they'd smash the femur, the upper leg bone of each leg. It can no longer support the weight on the little saddle at the bottom of it where they pushed up to get one more gasp of air. It would not be but 2 minutes or less before they would drown in their own airways. They couldn't breathe. When they came to Jesus, he was already gone. He was already dead. So what it says is, they wanted to make sure one last time, so they poked a spear in his side, somewhere around his rib cage, where his heart would have given out, and out came mingled blood and water. Blood and water. The two vehicles the church saw as the vehicles of grace. The blood was seen shimmering in the cup of the Lord's Supper, the fruit of the vine. This is the blood of my covenant. This is the blood shed for you. Blood. But then there's the water that cleanses a man from his sin, the water that brings him in connection with the death of Christ. So much so that Paul would put these two things together, blood and water, death and life. Do you not know that all of us who've been baptized into Christ Jesus were baptized into his death? We were buried, therefore, with him by baptism into death, that in order as Christ was raised from the dead, we too, by the glory of the Father, might be risen to a new life. Think about that. Blood and water put together. On that cross, they all come together. The blood which cleanses and the water which washes away. This is the testimony. I saw the blood and the water. John would mention that again in his first letter. It was an important theme for him. The blood of Christ and the cleansing waters of baptism. But the last thing that John wants to mention in our lesson today is the burial of Jesus. The burial is pretty much like it is in the rest of the Gospels, except for one thing. He tells us about the people who buried him in a very unique way. Listen to what it says at the end of chapter 19. After these things, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly, for fear of the Jews, asked Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus. And Pilate gave him permission. So he came and took the body. And Nicodemus also, who earlier had come to Jesus by night, came bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds in weight. So they took the body of Jesus and bound it in linen cloth with the spices, as the burial customs of the Jews said. Now in the place where he was crucified there was a garden, and in that garden a new tomb, in which no one had yet been laid. So because of the Jewish day of preparation, and since the tomb was close at hand, they laid Jesus there. Two men, Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, all come together at one spot. Now, what's interesting, we know something a little bit about Joseph of Arimathea. He is a disciple of Jesus, it says, but Luke tells us some of his background. In Luke chapter 23 and verse 50, he says, there was a man named Joseph from the Jewish town of Arimathea, a member of the council, the Sanhedrin, the group of 70, who made all religious decisions for Israel, the ones who had decided Jesus was going to die. He was a member of that council. The difference, he was a good and righteous man, Luke says. I wonder how he sat in those chambers when they were deliberating the death of Jesus, what he was doing, what was going through his mind. The other is Nicodemus. We know that Nicodemus, in John chapter 3, came to Jesus by night. He is a ruler of the Jews. He too belongs to the council, because in John chapter 7, when the Sanhedrin is talking about what they're going to do with Jesus, he's creating a stir. We can't let him get away with this, so we need to arrest him and get him out of the way. It was Nicodemus who speaks up and says, does our law judge a man without first giving him a hearing and learning what he does? And they slapped him down and said, are you two from Galilee? Think about it. These two men sat in the same room, and I suspect, I can't prove this, but I suspect each one had this growing belief in Jesus, that he was indeed the Messiah, but they never talked to each other about it until the cross came. And there they came together to bury the body of Jesus. They were doing something that's very important. They were sacrificing something great. Both men were giving up the observance of Passover. For once you touch a dead body, you were not ceremonially clean. They were giving everything up for Jesus. They had perhaps believed in him secretly. One came by night, the other just kind of held his convictions close. But now, there at that cross, they made it very public where they stood about this man who had been condemned to die and now hung limp on a cross. Jesus promised something. Back in chapter 12 of John, he says, "And when I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw all people to myself." And here it is. He's drawing secret disciples out into the open. The cross has had an effect, and they have now had to state where they stand. So we come to the end of this lesson and the death of Jesus. All that is left is the resurrection and the post-resurrection, that John handles differently as well, that we'll handle next week. But I'd like to think for a moment the effect that the cross had in this lesson. No one comes away from the cross without it having some effect on them. In fact, the cross exposes the hearts of men. Can't get away from that. The cross will expose your heart. Your reaction to the cross, no matter who you are, where you are, or how you felt before, it will expose your heart. For some, like Pilate's, many just don't want to face it. We do live in a world today in which, if you talk to many people about Christ, they just don't want to hear it. They're satisfied with who they are, what they are. They don't want to be interrupted. They don't want to be upset. They are comfortable. What's interesting is that Jesus died on the cross and Pilate remained comfortable. I always wonder if this haunted him. We have no record that it did. But there are some people like him. Are you like that? You just not want to face it. There are some like the guards there that remain indifferent. They don't want to hear it. They just don't care if they hear it. When they hear it, they don't care. For some people, this is an act of history. For others, this is an act of mythology. They just don't care one way or another. If you want to believe that Jesus is the Son of God, that's fine. I don't care. I've approached people to ask them to study with me, and a lot of times what they will say is, you know, something I really don't, because I don't really care one way or another. And some people don't. But the third, there are some who are like Joseph and Nicodemus, who show that they believe, finally. It exposes a heart that says, I've been thinking, I've been considering, and now I'm convinced. Think about those three reactions: ignorance, indifference, and belief. Which describes you? Because in the end, one of the things that John did have to say in this whole situation was, he who saw it has borne witness, and his testimony is true, and he knows that he's telling the truth, that you may also believe. And all John wants to ask when you come to the cross is, do you believe the witness? Next week will be on Sunday morning with the grave open and Jesus doing great things before he leaves the earth. Thank you for joining me. I hope you've had a good day and we've enjoyed our lessons together. I know that I have. So I wish you my best and hope you have a great day. I'll see you again next Sunday.